All right, so we'll go ahead and begin.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so this is episode 21 of the Following Mechanical Turks project, which apparently has become the Decameron. This is our first of, well, we'll see how many confined episodes. Everybody doing good? Everybody doing well, I should say?
Yeah. I mean, I am. I can't speak to everybody else, but yeah.
If you're tuning in, you're with us here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what we wanted to do, since obviously institutionally things changed a bit, is we wanted to kind of go through some of the processes we were going to be doing independently in terms of taking a look at some of the material we've already processed to try and identify things like key terms and, couplets or pairs. In fact, let me just share my screen with you here. Okay, so in fact, let's just take a look here. And so you can see my outline here, right?
Yes.
Got a bunch of balls in the air because I'm VPN'd into my work computer. Okay. So, I mean, and this is something that that came up. So depending on how we approach this topic, we may or may not, I think I put it in this comment over here, in fact, does an overview need to be a separate grounding section? So I bring this up, and it's relevant to what we're doing today because, if we're approaching through, as we thought, a framework of labor, labor specifically, and then how that manifests, particularly in things like compensation, it may not make sense to begin with sort of an overview of here's what we see in the data as a whole. It may make sense to begin with, if that's the issue, start with, okay, so the first thing we can do is categorize things by compensation. And then we'd still be doing this stuff, but it would be, as it says here, a means to identify things like key terms, right? Mm-hmm. So that is to say, if we're approaching through labor, it may make sense, when we actually get to the, the methods and the results and everything, to start by, okay, we'll categorize by compensation tiers. We've got the keyness and the TF-IDF. Let's look inside of those to find, because it does, let's look inside of those for, terms and couplets so we can zoom down to the word level. That's the whole reason we're doing this.
Yeah.
And so there's this larger question of, does it make sense to start with an overarching, okay, well, this is the data as a whole. Now, I think it still might if this is the grounding, right? So let's look at the corpus as a whole, and then let's look at it in terms of labor, because one could make the argument, if you start with this, the categorization, and say, oh, well, this pops up, in the top 20 or whatever, this is significant. There is a legitimate question about, well, how does that compare to the corpus as a whole? Okay. Are you seeing an artifact? You know what I mean? Yeah. Are you seeing an artifact by doing this and saying, oh, well, this is significant? Or is it just prevalent in the thing as a whole? So I'm kind of two minds about this, in part because we don't at this juncture really know specifically how are we approaching this operations task, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
So as the thinking then is, if we skip that and almost just thinking in terms of how our argument will be read, will it look like we've either skipped a step or haven't properly established the significance of what we're talking about, because there's no move early on that marks how, we looked at this and then here's the way that we're going into it. And if we just go into it, then there'll be a sort of a kind of doubt around our method, because we never did a kind of, not zoom out, but a kind of we're not showing what we're seeing alongside other things that we could have seen.
Yeah.
So thus it's hard. We can't then make the argument, but we think this is potentially the most fruitful way of seeing it, because it is in fact how I lost the term, but a valid approach or something like that.
Yeah, part of it is, if I were talking to a student or advising someone who submitted to a journal, right, and they were talking about labor in this thing, I'm sure there'd be a part of me that would say, don't faff about here, get to what you're talking about here.
Right.
Yeah. Part of me feels like I want to include this because I've done it.
right.
You know what I mean? And so it's sort of the old, I can't get rid of this. I spent a lot of time and labor doing this, but if I were advising someone else and I was like, well, if you want to talk about labor and compensation, don't mess around here. Just jump to this. However,
we used labor.
This is the means we're using to get at this.
Yeah.
Start there. This is all fluff. However, because there are two things. One is, I'm not exactly sure that's how we're approaching it, because the complications we found with the heteromation model, right?
Yeah.
And then also, this may need to be there even if we are focusing on labor, because we may need to have just a baseline of here's what the corpus says as understood through frequencies and some basic topic modeling stuff.
Yeah.
And okay, now let's pull that apart by putting this material into compensation tiers and then zoom. So I don't think it's a choice we have to make right now. It's just I'm conscious of it.
Yeah.
And we're doing this because our task for today, and I already, of course, started noodling with this, is this to zoom into this word level comparison, right? That's what we were supposed to be doing. And so the question arises, when we do this, should we start with something like the keenness measures, right? And start saying, oh, okay, well, to get an interesting couplet or an interesting term, we should start with something like the keenness measures of the TF-IDF and say, okay, here's one that's from top 20% and one that's from bottom 20%. Why are these in that?
Right.
If we're using this to get to our word level comparison, that's different than if we're using just raw frequencies, So for example, I am interested in the difference between transcribe, the stem for transcribe and transcript and transcription, which is, more or less transcri, SRI, and summara, the stem for summarize and summary and all of that. But I found that in the raw frequencies, it doesn't really super significantly manifest here, right? So if I'm saying that's an interesting, and I think it's an interesting labor concern.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily it doesn't manifest in things like compensation necessarily, right?
Yeah.
So
compensation is just, so one of the distinctions here maybe is that compensation was a way for us to generate lots of useful approaches to looking at this in terms of labor, but we're also able to get at some labor things through frequency.
Well, so, part of this thinking is, are we moving here in a zoom from broad to narrower to more narrow, or are these subsets essentially autonomous of a broader concern about labor? If we look at this as a whole, saying this is what labor is, now one way to consider labor is to do this, categorization by compensation. Another way is to zoom into word level.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Then in this case, this isn't a tidy zoom. It's more like, here's an overview of things with particular interest to labor. And here are ways to get at those variably through categorization, through word level examination, right?
No, I think increasingly, or at least not increasingly, or maybe so, that right, labor is not now a particular facet of this project. I mean, I think that's now that would be the I think that's maybe like our key, right? It's no longer a means, right? Because before, right, I mean, it's sort of maybe this is sort of the conceptual shift too, right? That we got really interested in our overarching theme was how the difference between human and non-human intelligence gets parsed within mechanical Turks. And labor was going to be a helpful way of doing that, right? So in that sense, the concept of labor was a tool for noticing how the difference between human and non-human intelligence was being parsed.
Uh-huh.
But I think the more we're thinking about labor, it's moved up potentially as a parallel, right? As opposed to being a way into that distinction.
Yeah.
It's I think it's so bound up in that distinction within mechanical Turks that I don't think labor is one possible way to get at the human non-human distinction. It may be that it's about both labor and human non-human distinction at the same time, as opposed to labor being a way into that distinction.
That's, I mean, it's an interesting point because arguably the thing itself is predicated on labor, right? I mean, mechanical
so
Turk
it's not a surprising result, but
right, yeah.
But
I mean,
labor,
all of this is really just to say it's something to think about as we do our word level comparisons. You know, do we want to just, as I was, kind of poke around with what are the frequencies? What do the clusters and topic models show? Or do we want to, you know, pay particular attention to the keenness measures and that kind of thing? I mean, probably at this stage, just whatever, you know, just use whatever you can to see, here are some interesting word level things that we might examine further through these other operations, you know, pairwise and bigram stems and all that.
Well, and that I mean, that works well with our articulation of our method, which is we're not necessarily trying to drill down to what's really there. We're doing a more exploratory kind of thing. So I think seeing these not as a zoom makes it, to see it as a zoom, I think would be what you'd want to do if we were in fact trying to find out what's really going on, right? We'd keep zooming down. But I think given what we're doing, it's perhaps also to see these as not necessarily nested inside each other,
okay,
but sort of entangled, right? That word level comparison isn't a zoom from categorization, which isn't a zoom from frequency. These are just things we can toggle amongst to try to get a sense of the shape of this thing.
Yeah. And see, originally, that's kind of how this worked was, well, we'll try some different operations and see what's in there. It's just, you know, part of my methodological discomfort with the potential pose of, you know, it's almost like you do this and then it's like you dust off your hands and say, well, that's what was in there, you know?
Right.
Like we tried a few things and now here's some things that popped out. I mean, it's kind of like, it's sort of sometimes my methodological frustrations with students where it's like, I've done some stuff and here's some stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but can you put that into a kind of line for me, you know?
Yeah.
Anywho, I don't think we need to fret about it too much. It's just something I was encountering because we're now at the stage of let's look for word level and, you know, couplet stuff. I was sort of like, where do we go to do that? You know? Yeah. Speaking of which, here's something else that popped out. In fact, I need to change the check marks here. So the keenness measures that I was looking at and you've looked at before.
Yeah.
Those are super helpful. Those diagrams are super helpful. You know what I didn't do though? I didn't run these taking into account available hits.
Oh.
Yep, just like when we did frequencies. In fact, let's make this practical.
Man, it's a real bonus.
So like if you look at the sample collected processed.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I mean That was something that was one of our earlier discussions.
Yeah. Well, so it's a facet of keenness just as it is here. So just to, so we're all on the same page here. These are the results. We've got these tabs at the bottom. These are the results if you just take our raw data and do things like frequency counts, right?
Yeah.
But when we look at our raw data, and let me make sure I pull up the public ones. Yeah, so that it doesn't, yes. But if we look at our raw data here, you've got available hits, almost 70,000 of whatever this thing is. Shoe comp may contain adult content. What?
I think, if you go back to the tapes, I think we've giggled at that a few times already.
It's strange, but whatever. I mean, maybe they mean adult, like you need grown-up cognitive skills to do this. I don't know.
I doubt that.
You need accounting abilities. When you see adult content, it means can you do your taxes?
Yeah, adult content means you're no longer counting on your fingers.
But anywho, just, so the available hits, which means that this individual task had 70,000 slots where people could do whatever this thing is. This had over 50. So the thing is, when you do frequencies, if you just count these up, there is an argument to be made. Well, and let's not even put this in terms of which one is right, but it's just like, as a user, as a Turker, you're not seeing 60 or 70 or 50,000 of those. You see one and it tells you there's this many slots. And it could be the case that if you do this, you can't do any more. Some hits won't let you do it multiple times. I mean, imagine something like a psychological survey. They don't want you to take it more than once. They've got your data, right?
Yeah.
So you might, as a Turker, you might see this as, well, it's just one thing that I can or can't do. But if we are trying to see this from the perspective of the unit, of the Turk, then that's, well, no.
Then that's important.
Yeah, this is the bulk of the series, dude. I mean, everything else is, one or, you go just a few down here and it's exponentially different, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's single digits, here. And this is just one sample. So the point is, it radically changes. These survey is the highest, minute hit if you're not accounting for hits. If you do the math or you just multiply, right, that one is worth 70,000, the one underneath it is worth 50,000. It bumps up to this, where shop is our most frequent unigram. And you can see its frequency is what? That's in the millions, right?
I mean, but look at those, right? Shop, item, receipt, image, survey, purchase, extract. I mean, those are,
It changes, And in fact, what's curious is if you expand them, well, let's do this because we're doing it right now. If we look at unigrams, we've got survey, minute, complete study. It's like, okay, so if you don't expand them, it feels like in terms of unigrams, it's talking about like completing surveys, right? I mean, that's what it's talking about here. And then it gets down to this one pretty quickly, which is the weird non-human audience one. If you go to bigrams, what does it start seeing here? Okay, we've still got survey and minute, but then we also get things like Hurricane Harvey, well-being, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we go to bigrams, non-expanded, it really sort of starts to change. And then if you go up to trigrams, again, we've got like survey, but then we've got these interesting things like COPE, mental health. And it's like, wow, that really changes from unigram, where it's like answer a survey, whatever. And these other things, ISIN, which is searching for stock codes and that kind of stuff. Bigrams, it starts to see the creep of things like Hurricane Harvey. Well-being is down here. Mm-hmm. Trigrams really helps it emerge, right? Yeah. But if we look at them expanded, shop, item, receipt, this is all extracting information from receipts.
Yeah.
Bigrams, pretty much the same. Shopping, receipt, most of these are all stop words. Extract, purchase, it's pretty consistent. Trigrams, again, from a shop receipt, extract, purchase. It's like, once you expand, it really tells the same story no matter how you look at it.
Right.
Shopping, extract data from receipts. Right?
Yeah.
the story is pretty much the same. It changes from unigram, bigram, trigram if you don't expand them. Now,
and again, expanding based on
number of available hits.
Yeah.
So, someone's follow-up question is immediately, well, what's the real story? Is it taking into account the available hits, or is it not? And the answer is, well, it's both. I mean, from the Turkers' perspective, the story is probably much more this one, the one that's not expanded, because you're not seeing 70,000 of that hit. You're seeing one hit that has 70,000 slots. But from the bulk perspective, from the perspective of the Turk, this story is always extract data from shop receipts, Yeah. That's just the bulk of what's on it.
Yeah. And that is, if we've got to pick, which we won't really have to, that I think still is we're interested in how this system itself is. And then I guess what would then be interesting then is based on those expanded unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams, what does the compensation then?
Well, so yes. And so what we have right now for the compensation, or for the like the keenness measures, that maps to the unexpanded one.
Okay.
So like if we look at top 20 unigram, and this one's always been interesting to me because it's one of the least clear to me, right? Mm-hmm. It's banner, ad, compens, okay, follow-up, that one I know. And part of this I just know because I've looked at this data for over a year now. So I just kind of know what stuff is.
Uh-huh.
But this one to me, okay, it's sort of about brands. You see brand pop up, although brand actually shows up in quite a lot of them.
Yeah. Particularly if you go out to the bigram level, brand moves up.
Yeah, and right now I'm just looking at unigrams. If we look at the other ones, like, okay, let's do 0, so no compensation for unigram. It's actually kind of cool because it's like, oh, it's these weird non-human readable ones. It's like, oh, okay, well, those are the zeros. The pennies gets into this weird like election stuff.
Yeah, which I like leader.
Yeah, and we can zoom into that. Wikipedia is on there, which is interesting. So we can zoom into that just with quick, or just simple finds in the data and look at what's this election stuff and why does that have a penny compensation. The bottom 20, searching for ISN codes. This is interesting to me because, shop extract shows up here, right? And it really kind of does start to put this narrative together. If shop, extract, receipt are so important in the whole, right?
Yeah.
Here's where they show up in the bottom 20, which is interesting because bottom 20 and top 20 are small categories, right? The biggest chunk is that middle 60.
Yeah.
And so for it to show up here, it's like, wow, it's really focused. That's in a sense, the most common thing is this extract, shop, receipt BS. And yet it's not reflected in the biggest compensation tier. It's really idiosyncratic to low, but over a penny. Low compensation, but over the threshold of penny, which is really a special case because that's just, it's sort of like it's just to see that you're doing something. It's, it's the lowest possible compensation tier. And a lot of those jobs are either prereqs, like we see with the 0, or it's the lowest possible thing we can give you. So this one to me is like, oh, that's interesting because it's above that threshold, but it's in the lower 20%. And yet it's dealing with these terms that
appear to be what the whole thing is about.
Yes. Yeah. And so it is sort of like a lot, you can make a claim. A lot of what's going on in the Turk is this sort of what we would call low skill labor of machine readable stuff, extract information from a source, right? A receipt, or other uses of extract. And see, this would be a useful one to drill into. What are other bigrams that stem from extract, right? Yeah. So anywho, that one is interesting to me. The middle 60 is kind of interesting because you can start to see things like well-being and mental health start to creep in.
Yeah.
So that's middle compensated. And you'd almost think, why isn't that well compensated. You know, it's like, in a sense, those are things that are human specific. Talk about your trauma.
Right.
You know, why don't those appear in the top 20? Why is the top 20 this kind of ambiguous brandy stuff, you know?
Yeah. No, that's why I mean, the for the purposes of as a sorting mechanism, that the heteromation stuff was going to be, I mean, I still think it will be useful, but not right now. But at least when I went through it, that's the kind of interesting thing that sort of popped up to me.
Yeah.
That you would think that if we thought there would be a kind of clean map of compensation levels onto humanness.
Yep.
It's not what we'd expect to find, which is really interesting. I mean, I think that it may be that actually that there's a certain kind of emotional labor. Is it low skilled emotional labor? I mean, to a certain extent, right? Only a human can tell you how they feel about Hurricane Harvey.
But it's not hard.
But how hard? It's not hard though. Yeah, it made me feel sad. That doesn't take a long time. So there's a weird sense in which it's potentially uniquely human. But I mean, I'm on Twitter, not particularly hard to emote. So they're not gonna compensate you for just telling me how you feel, because it's human, but it's not particularly valuable labor. I don't know. Or
yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, these are interesting questions. But here's an additional wrinkle. I didn't run them expanded, which I started to do because I realized.
So what you shared with us are just lies.
Well, I mean, it asks this question, right? Yeah. Because it's not like, well, this is the true one. It's the difference, right? But see, it didn't really pop up to me that I was like, oh, you know what? This is going to be dependent upon, because the way we get to keenness has to do with frequencies, you know? It has to do with how often does a term appear in a particular category. And so it's like, crap, that is dependent upon frequency. And frequency is dependent upon whether or not you expand out those categories to take into account number of hits, right? So you're following me, right?
Yeah.
So I started to do that. And the good news is I should be able to do this. I was a little concerned because when you expand out, when you take into account, it's a much more cognitively intense thing for the computer, because instead of dealing with 23,105 or 104, I can't remember, hits, it has to multiply, right? One of those is 70,000, right? So instead of dealing with things in the tens of thousands, you start dealing with things in the billions.
Yeah, no, it gets big real quick.
And so it makes the computer, it's like, well, I can count these for you, but I'm going to break a sweat. and it jumps up quite a bit. With unigrams, it'll do it. But with bigrams and trigrams, you kind of have to rub it and hope.
Yeah.
Because bigrams and trigrams, the numbers bump up. You would think it's like, hey, why isn't it less for bigrams and trigrams? Because you're dealing in units, right? Shouldn't it be less? The issue is that bigrams and trigrams doesn't remove stop words, because doing so would cause a fraudulent pairing, If you pulled out stop words and then did your bigrams, two words would be together, even though they're not actually together, because they could be separated in texts by multiple stop words.
Right.
So it makes your numbers bump way up. However, I'll make it work because it's no more labor intensive than doing the frequency things we already did.
Yeah.
Where the cognitive collapse will happen is making the DFM, the document frequency matrix. Once you do that, frequencies, keenness measures are gravy. So I'll do it. It's just I haven't had a chance to yet. Yeah. I did unigrams. I did it for unigrams.
Okay.
So let's take a look at these categories in comparison, right? So let's look at, the one that was interesting to me was top 20, right? So top 20, unexpanded, this is what it looks like. Let's look at top 20 unigram expanded. This is what it looks like. Now look at how weird this is. Structure, brave world, mood,
yeah.
Huxley novel? Yeah, so this raises the questions like, what the heck is it talking about here? Let's
Yeah.
find out.
Well, look at, by the way, do you see what terms were popping up there too? Analyze and summary.
Yes. Yes, I saw that.
There you
And
go, buddy.
sentiment.
Yeah.
Sentiment pops up.
I mean, it's almost on, yeah.
I didn't plan this. It's just, it's like, oh, well, after a while you get a sense of what this data actually is. But let me see, I'm VPN'd in. So this is, where would this be? I want all of them. Yes, there it is. And just people watching at home, this is not normally how my desktop looks. It's just, when you VPN from some computers, it will.
It's okay. No one's judging you.
I'm judging me. Normally this is sorted, sorted as in SORT, not sorted as in dirty.
Well, it's normally sorted, but sorted.
Yes. So just please understand, this is not normally how it looks. It's just when you VPN, often it does its own grouping.
Okay.
Anywho, so let's take a look at that, which I already have. Let's just do a find for Huxley. Because why is Huxley and Brave New World popping up? Because there is a job that falls into the high compensation tier. Brave New World, a sentiment analysis. Analyze the sentiments, emotions, and intensity of sentences from Huxley's novel, Brave New World. Holy cow. If that's not a human task, right? You're asking a computer to do sentiment analysis of emotions and intensity in a novel?
Yeah.
That is such a human task. And lo and behold, when you account for the number of hits available, right, which is this, that's time. This is number of hits, right? And it pops up in a lot of places. It's not just 592. Right. So if I do it again, it's the same task, but it's posted differently.
Oh, I see.
Because remember, it's because of the way we sample data. It could be literally the same thing that was posted for a long duration of time, or it could be the same task reposted.
Yeah.
Just remember, we sample data periodically, which means we could get some things that were technically the same post. It's just that they lingered for a long time. But we consciously said that's fine, because what that means is that job was there a long time.
Right.
That's important, right?
Yeah. That's part of it. For our purposes, frequency and duration are related in that way.
Duration in the sense of it being posted for a long time, not duration in how long do you have to do.
Yeah. How long it persists on the list of
persistence. Hits. We could call it persistence, right?
Persistence, I like that.
Which is important because it's like, but it lingers for a long time. So anyway, so this job of going into Brave New World, to me, it's like, holy cow, that's a really human task. And sure enough, when you account for number of hits, this is super prevalent in the top 20% of compensation, right? So that's one. I mean, to me, this was really useful because when I look at this, it's a little fuzzy, right? Again, these are both examining the top 20. The only difference is this is if you just take those posts straight up. This one is if you account for the number of hits, right? And so it's like, holy cow, this is talking about this human task of going into a novel and trying to suss out things like its sentiment, emotions, those kinds of things, right? Summarizing.
Well, and what's really interesting too is that in these expanded ones, I mean, we'd have to look at all of them, but it may be that it now potentially more compellingly maps onto some of those heteromation terms.
That could be, yeah. And it's also useful to look at its obverse here, because remember what it's doing is it's setting itself in opposition to the other categories.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Input,
shock, receipt. It's saying this is the opposite.
Yeah.
of this.
No, and I think more and more, if we're really going back to that notion of how does the system parse the distinction, that these that both have. I mean, I've had probably the maybe because it's blue and there's more of them. Just visually, I tend to want to look at the top, but I think it's the play between the top and the bottom that's what what we're kind of interested in is not just that it thinks to look at this and go, right, reading a novel is human. But I think no, reading a novel is not this, and that not this is the human.
It's opposed to shop, receipt, item, weird thing that is computer readable, right? A ACC match, ACC Japan, right?
So it's not just that top part is what the human is. It's the top part in relation to the bottom part.
Yeah.
The human is the distinction, not just the kind of work that's being asked for here.
And keep in mind, I mean, as we've talked about, we can do things and it might be useful, like take the top 20 compensation and put that just in opposition to the bottom 20, right? Mm-hmm. Right now, this is top 20 in opposition to the other 4 categories: 0, penny, bottom 20, middle 60. So it's in a sense kind of what's the uniqueness or the keyness. I mean, that's literally what this means. What's key to this category in opposition to everything else. But we can do it like, well, let's tease out the difference between the top 20 and the bottom 20 in unigrams, right?
Yeah.
And then it excludes the middle 60, the 0, the penny, and just says, well, let's look at those 2. We can do that. Although it's relatively easy to do.
Although what would even be interesting is you're looking at that bottom 20. I mean, I think the interesting comparison I think we should do them all, but right, not the bottom 20, but the top 20, but it may be the bottom 20 compared to the middle 60 and the top 20 compared to the middle. I mean, the middle 60 might be some kind of, we're seeing like the things we thought we'd see there. There's things in the bottom 20 that look kind of interesting. Why aren't they in which is to say that I think comparing the top 20 to the bottom 20 could be interesting, but I wonder about the top 20 and the bottom 20 compared to the middle 60, because it may be that's where we're seeing the break happen that is potentially interesting.
Yeah. And
right? Not top to bottom, but top to right below the top.
Yeah. Well, and you can combine these categories. I mean, we can literally do middle 60 versus top and bottom combined, right?
Yeah.
Or you could do top, middle, bottom versus penny and 0, right? Things that give you compensation versus things that give you no or
token compensation.
Perfunctory. Yes. I mean, there's every permutation. The danger, of course, as with all of these, is you spend as I muttered to myself last night, you spend your time just faffing about with the numbers. It's like you could permeate these or go through infinite permutations of this, Right. But it is something we can do, is put different tiers in conversation with each other, not with the whole. Just let's look at what happens when you do those 2 versus this one, or this one versus that one, or whatever. Anyway, so just really quickly, this is the top 20, and I did it for all of the unigrams here. So like if we look at the others, this is 0. And in fact, the 0 one, when you account for the number of available hits, it's still dominated by the computer readable one. However, look at how varied. So let's look at the 0 unigram. Here, it's all the computer readable, right? It's got ad hoc match, AC, AMM, right?
Yeah, they all seem sort of, except for interview, product, and brand, they all seem to be in that. Yeah, they're all versions of that.
But if we look at the expanded one, the one that does this and weights them by number of available hits, it starts with that. But look at all these other things here, right? Value, input, brand, calorie, which to me, I was really kind of interested when words like eat and dietary and calorie popped up, because a lot of times it's like, well, that's human eating, So it's interesting that when you account for that, this becomes a richer but less unified category, right? The 0.
Right. What looked like, yeah, the zero is that's where all the bots are doing their bot stuff. And now you
Yeah.
look at them going, I mean, we'd
Mm.
have to dig into those calorie ones because I mean, it could also just be looking at nutrition labels.
Yep. It definitely could.
In which case, a bot could easily scan calorie, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So in some cases, it clarifies. In some cases, it ambiguates. And then just really, well, let's see what else we've got. Penny here. Survey, attempt, market time, research. Let's look at survey here, or excuse me, penny here. This is the one that was all about elections, right? So penny is all about election, party, leader. If we look at it expanded, it's more about attempt, survey, market, research complete. I mean, this one actually gets a little fuzzier. Yeah, interesting what it's opposed to here in the gray bars too. Anywho, so it's sort of like, again, the question of, well, which one's the real one? Neither. It's just I think I need to, methodologically speaking, I just need to do the other ones, the other keenness measures, taking into account available hits. Yeah. Which isn't a big deal. I'm just going to have to, hope my computer can, which it can. It's done it before.
I mean, by the way, there's your transcribe.
On this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what is this? The bottom 20. Yeah, which actually is pretty consistent. Bottom 20 work tends to be, extract, transcribe from shopping receipts, right? It's almost perfect here. Let's see what it looks like here. Bottom 20. It's actually pretty darn close. Extract, shop, ISIN is in there, which is a stock code. We don't see transcribe, but we do when we expand it. Huh. Which I actually like to cut it back to transcribe because then it includes transcript. Yeah,
because they get broken up here because
they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a little bit where you have to, as a human being, combine some. Like, because the versions of summary and summarize get parsed out differently, and the British spelling of it, which is S. So
duration, a fortnight. Well, what's so fascinating about this? I mean, again, I can see why this would slowly drive anybody slightly cuckoo, but you in particular. We're looking at the same data set, and you just change one thing, and it looks completely different.
Well, and eventually you get a pool of words, and it's like you're standing in front of two dachshunds, shoving them together and saying, "Now kiss," little child with dolls.
That was a weirdly,
you're together.
That was a weirdly specific analogy.
Well, it comes from my youth about trying to get dachshunds to mate. I had a friend who had two dachshunds that they were trying to get to breed, and I was like, "So are you just standing there shoving them together?" It's like, how do you?
So I was in an exchange program in high school. So I went to Germany for a while, and I went with the host mother. They had a female dog, and we just spent 2 days driving around, for near as I could tell, pimping her out. Yeah. Like just bringing her to various male dogs and seeing if while she was in heat, they could make it happen.
Yeah. That's what I'm doing with key terms right now. Is like, you get them together and it's like, now you're together. Now you're together. You've got all these pieces, and it can drive you mad trying to figure out how should these go together. It's as though it's a box of puzzle pieces, and there's any number of shapes that you could combine. The puzzle pieces can go, any one of them can go with anyone else, and if you put them together, it gets this.
Aren't there puzzles like that? Those infinity puzzles where you can like build it, and then you can just keep. Yeah, but
this is one where it's as though the pieces are just squares, and so they can all go together. Right. And however you put them together, it's a different image, right? They're all just colored squares. So you put them together, it's like, oh, well, this is
like one those intelligence tests.
Yeah, it's like variable.
Except there's no flashcards with the shapes already printed on them that we have to recreate.
Anywho, so
I like the dogs mating analogy better.
That's my touchstone. Is now kiss.
Now kiss.
anywho, so I mean, I can finish these up because I've only done it for unigrams. And then the other thing is I'd need to run it also with the TF-IDF measurements of the compensation tiers, because that's something else we've got here too. We don't always look at that one, but let me see. Did I even upload it? I must have. Yeah. Yeah. So we also have the TF-IDF measurements by compensation tier, which is itself something separate but interesting. So like if you break them into compensation tier, you get TFI, and you can run TF-IDF measurements of it. So this one is top 20. If you, instead of doing keenness, if you do TF-IDF, it's just another way of having significant terms surface.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is top 20 using TF-IDF, right? Study, survey, hit, compensation, complete, participate, follow up. The bigrams are you will, compensate, minutes, study, banner, blah, blah, blah. It's actually not radically different from keenness.
Yeah, I was noticing. Yeah.
It's just another way of looking at, like, which, you know, some surfaces like this, right? In the trigram, if you do TF-IDF, it surfaces things like relive past event as a trigram, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it surfaces things. In fact, like I was trying to get a handle on, so what are we seeing here, right? You know, things like, one thing we see is transcribing information from a source, right? That's the shopping receipt extract. There's also ones where you have to do it from, you know, written or audio, or maybe even it's locating ISIN codes. That's one thing you do according to Mechanical Turk. Okay. Another thing you do is, summarizing, as we saw. Describing trauma is something you do on Mechanical Turk. That can be like Hurricane Harvey, talking about your experience with cancer, your well-being and mental health coping. Those are the terms that pop out for that one: cope, mental health, the hurricane stuff. I mean, out of the millions of permutations that I've been going through in order just to get my arms around these data, I've started to notice it's like, so what's in there globally? What do you do? And I think what's that?
I said, right. I mean, yeah.
And I mean, I think there are sort of themes that pop out. Themes like extracting information from an existing source. The most common one being shopping receipts, right? Yeah. Summarizing things that have some sort, that require some sort of analytical capacity. Yeah, so summarize this video, summarize this audio, the sentiment stuff with Brave New World, right? Mm-hmm. Talk about your trauma through a survey or whatever. That's a thing you do. Out of all these permutations, it's like you can start to see themes emerge in terms of what's going on in Mechanical Turk. That's why all these millions of ways to look at things, right? Frequencies, keenness measures, when we ran through clusters and categories and LDA models, right? Clusters, topic models. In a sense, you kind of see the same stuff. I mean, it is all the same data, right? So you start to see the same stuff. It's just kind of different ways allow different aspects of it to surface.
Yeah. Which is good. I mean, it means that we're looking for different aspects to surface, but that the way that we're approaching it isn't radically different from other ways we could approach it, which does, I mean, I think that's where the kind of, if we're looking for how solid our method might be, we're like, well, yeah, we've got an approach and we tried it multiple ways and we roughly found the same shape of it. And then we picked this particular way of diving into it. And I mean, that may go back to your original question that you started with, which was how to relate the various things to each other, right? We use these frequency counts and all these other things, and then we tried it this way, and we noticed generally the same sort of thing. And we're going with this one because it allows us to dig into it in a way that makes sense for us.
Yeah.
So do we want to do some, what were we going to do next?
I mean, what we were basically going to do was look at, we were finding, we're zooming down to the word level. So like finding words and couplets, right? And I already kind of started doing that. I mentioned transcribe and summary. I got interested in things like cope, mental health, cancer. I think one that should probably be here is maybe something like extract.
Yeah. Brand, well, although again, Brand showed up early, but then it seems to have, well, we'll see.
But it's worth, I mean, it's worth finding these terms and then, yeah, I mean, like, let's see, let's just check for Brand. So in terms of frequency, it's slot 70 there, but it manifests in our other things in interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, it tends to show up a lot in that top 20 category.
Right.
And then there was a couple other ones that might, I mean, some of these might just be in addition to transcribe and summarize, like it seemed like a couple of other related terms, like because we have extract on there, but audit and classify showed up in some of those zero compensation hits. So like, if we wanted to even make the kind of couplet of transcribe and summary, I wonder if there's maybe even like a nest of terms, right? That audit, classify, that maybe, like is audit a less, I lost it now, but right, that those terms might also be related.
Yeah.
The mechanical Turks, extraction, transcription, summarizing, that those are a continuum of intelligence tasks.
And that would be an interesting thing, is to say, can you get at that by using these two, or does it make sense to collapse transcribe and extract and classify on one side and summary and, maybe audit? I'd have to check and see. And the way to answer this would be something like, well, look at these terms in context, right?
That's what I was thinking, right? And
we
may end up with couplets, but we might also end up with, I don't know, even like chains of these terms.
Yeah, and it would be possible to say, okay, well, there's a difference in these two things, transcribey stuff, which includes extract and find, right, and summary stuff. And the division there those are two different kinds of labor task, right? One asking for maybe a more rote, it appeals to sensory data. I mean, that's what transcription does, is it's like, are you literate and do you have eyes, right? In fact, it's not even literacy, is it? It's just replicate what you're seeing.
Yeah.
Versus summarization, summarizing, which seems like a cognitively different task. It asks you to have an intellectual capacity in a way that, reproducing characters you see maybe doesn't. It speaks to, remember that split of high and low tasks? I was
just thinking, like, right, that what's really interesting about that kind of result is, even because they're called hits, right? It's human intelligence tasks. And right, historically, one of the key distinctions for the human has been its intelligence. But what we're learning from here is like, but you've got eyes in a way that a computer doesn't have, right? So weirdly enough, there's some aspects that are uniquely human that aren't going to be high intelligence, because a human being we've been talking about a lot of this in my new media class, because we're looking a lot at sensation. Mm-hmm. And looking at the human being as a set of sensors,
right?
We're actually a pretty robust sensing device compared to,
Yes.
ticks or whatever. But so it may not necessarily be that transcription doesn't look as if it's as intelligent as summary, but it's still uniquely human insofar as it needs a particular set of sensors to do.
You know what? Before I lose it, I wonder if Polanyi's dilemma could be an organizing principle where perhaps if the heteromation categories don't work out, could we look at them through the lens of this kind of binary where there's a value in the what it sees as the high and the low, which is precisely this. It's like we can smell. A robot can't smell, right? I mean, trying to make a smelling robot is difficult. I just saw some news about, they can do things like sense gas molecules, but is that smell? And and they can only do what they're trained to do, right? Yeah. So there's this schism between the high and the low, which are both in that paradox, in a sense, sort of like super valuable because they're things that are difficult for machines, right? The middle, the machines can do, but very high intellectual tasks and very low, we call them low, but they're like, human.
Well, I think that's what's really interesting, right? Is whereas from a particular humanist perspective, to pull out my favorite whipping boy, right? You'd want to put transcribe and summary on different ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And what Mechanical Turks does is actually puts them both on the same side.
They're valuable.
Yes,
right?
they are both. They're not human in the ways in which a certain kind of Platonic humanism might want to see them as more or less, as one is more human than the other. From the standpoint of Mechanical Turks, they are both uniquely human abilities.
And it's why also something like talking about your mental health and trauma fits into that category of value, because as a human, you have risk that a machine does not. A human gets cancer.
Right.
A machine doesn't get cancer. A human can talk about its experience of cancer. A machine will never.
Yeah.
Not gonna. We'll see.
So from one perspective, and this is when it gets interesting, right? That from another perspective, vulnerability to cancer doesn't mark in a lot of schemas, that's not a big difference for human versus non-human. But in Mechanical Turks, it is.
Yeah.
That's how Mechanical Turks parses the human. I mean, this gets to our interesting IRB conversation.
Yes. That humans are things that are subject to risk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a factor of it. And, it could be that paradox becomes a useful organizational principle. Can we align things on those poles of what we consider to be high intellectual and low physical, right? You have a human body, and can we see those manifest in ways, in the hits? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's particularly interesting in this particular moment as we realize the value of low skill, low wage work, which apparently that's the scaffolding for all of this.
Yes.
I mean, it's not a surprise for some people who've potentially been paying attention, but
yeah, I mean, I didn't want to necessarily incorporate that, but I mean, it is so relevant right now where you see who are the indispensable people right now. It's stuff like doctors and grocery store stockers.
The whole parsing, the political parsing of essential versus non-essential.
Yes.
Is another potential cultural technique.
Yeah, we should be writing this down for the later work. Yeah. It may not manifest here, but this discussion of, being essential. I mean, you do see things like doctors are essential. As much as people quail at this, politicians are essential because they are the ones who are going to be making these, the governor saying where you can and can't go. That's essential now, right? The politicians still have to be active. And then we tend to see it as the other end of the spectrum. We need people stocking grocery store shelves or we're all going to die.
Yeah. So whereas before you had this split, the coronavirus basically, no, they're all on this side now.
Yep.
That the difference isn't between high skill, high wage, low wage, low skill. The difference is between essential and non-essential. And that new sorting mechanism totally changes the arrangement of labor.
Yeah. And it starts to say, on the other end of that, it's not high skill, low skill, it's essential and non-essential. Who's non-essential? Most of us, right?
The middle 60. The middle 60.
The middle 60. I mean, it's probably even less. It's probably, the middle, 80, 85?
Yeah.
Because it turns out, even you and I mean, we're still doing our jobs, but, yesterday we had a discussion about, not only who's going to take over my courses when I die in a couple of weeks, but also should this semester be pass fail? Yeah. Does that matter anymore?
Yeah.
Right? It's sort of like all of us have suddenly realized we're not essential to the operation of society.
I mean, hence the kind of societal shakeup where you've got a certain kind of strata where let's say a financial advisor, although they might, a certain kind of job would see themselves as more like a doctor than they are like a grocery store clerk.
We would.
And what they realized is, no, you're over here. The grocery store clerk is much more like the doctor than you are.
Yep.
It just depends on what system you're now using to sort society.
Yep. Yes. And I don't want to get into an essentialist claim as we see right now, which is, well, when the shit hits the fan, what really is the case.
Yeah, I don't want to say that either, but in this particular compelling social arrangement.
In this frame, it's a question of frames, right? And in this frame, the notion of who gets joined together is no longer us with fancy book learning and those without fancy book learning. It's who can keep the society going versus who can cool their heels for a few weeks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to be recording this because, I mean, God, depending on how things shake out, it could be the entire frame for at least one of our later pieces, if we're able to get to it, in terms of illuminating. This is dependent upon cultural, situated parsings of who belongs together.
I mean, and maybe for the third piece, because what this does is it throws into sharp relief what a cultural technique does in parsing and making distinctions.
Yeah. Yes.
And what's interesting is, I mean, this is now the sort of meta level of what we're doing, is that essentially the coronavirus is similar to our debate about whether or not to use frequency or right, that it's a framework that's then organizing what's happening. So in that sense, the coronavirus is actually a method it's a cultural technique for sorting people.
It's a machine. It's a sorting machine. Yeah. Gosh, I mean, we're really seeing that in monstrous ways now about who's going to get to live or die. I mean, there are going to be choices made about care, right? Yeah. It's a sorting machine.
Well, what's interesting is it's bumping up against capitalism, which is another sorting scheme.
Yeah. I mean, the discourse of it's interesting about how questions of life change after you're no longer productive, right?
Yeah.
You're no longer working and spending, you can die. And maybe that's why we value fetus as a potential customer versus old person who is no longer customer.
No, you can see why would because if your overriding mechanism is economic, a child, you can infinitely speculate upon the value of a child's life.
They have many years to be a producer and a consumer. An old person, you're just taking resources now for maintenance. Yeah, it's a strange conversation. What's odd to me is that the Overton window has expanded to accept this. That to me is what's interesting. Yeah. Is that in acceptable discourse, it's should we be killing
within a week. I mean, I was sort of watching it on Twitter, and people were like, somebody was saying this on Monday, and then someone chimed in and said, by Friday this is going to be a perfectly acceptable talking point. Sure as shit it was.
Yep. Yeah, the Overton window just
Yeah, somebody's weird tweet, someone's horrific tweet on Monday was a thing someone says looking right down at the barrel of a camera with a straight face.
Let me see. It is the Overton window. Yes, yes, yes. All right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, again, right? As soon as you said Overton window, I'm thinking about cultural techniques. Then the original analogy was doors and gates.
Yeah,
so those are what parse what's acceptable or not, or what's.
Yes. I mean, that's the metaphor it uses, is this kind of frame. And indeed, I mean, when I do this thing practically, like when we do word embeddings, that is also the terminology, is the window, because what it does is it takes a term and then it looks at it in context and it counts the terms to either side of it. So it calls it a sliding window, where you look at a term and you say, here are the terms 1, 2, 3 out in front of it and 1, 2, 3 behind it. Now let's slide the window over and look at the next term and do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it's called a sliding window when you do things like word embeddings or word vectors, same thing. Let me write down in the notes page, where would this go?
Under the category gold, Jerry.
Well, I want to put it somewhere where we're not going to overlook it. I mean, maybe just here at the end. And MISC. It's the problem with these documents is it's like they get hard to wrangle. I don't think it's going to have to go here. Well, you know, there's a section on cultural techniques, right? Let me see here. Things like Turk, that may be an aspect of cultural technique.
Yeah, I'll go back through because I've got some notes on the Polyani piece. And we need like elevator music for these portions when we're both taking notes.
Yeah, this is great video.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I mean is, as I'm thinking about this too, is one potentially interesting thing that Mechanical Turks might do, or at least less, you know, I mean, from a certain kind of labor standpoint, it's less than ideal. But it may be one of the things it does is it really productively redefines what intelligence is. Because we're seeing a lot of things, because they're called human intelligence tasks. And what we're seeing is a lot of things under there that maybe from a certain standpoint wouldn't get classified as intelligence. So you know, the idea that it's potentially reparsing both the human and intelligence, because it's right. The notion that it's going to put transcribe and summary on the same side of a division means that it sees both of those as intelligence tasks, whereas we might want to put more space between them in terms of relative intelligence. It doesn't see them as differently intelligence. It just sees them as these are two intelligence tasks that get compensated differently. but they're both intelligence tasks.
Yeah.
Which is what COVID-19 is revealing, which is right. The difference is not difference in relative intelligence. The difference is the difference in relative compensation or essential.
Yeah.
I mean, a certain humanist is going to want to parse things in terms of intelligence, sort of in a Platonic pure form.
Yep.
And what's happening with both Turks and COVID-19 is it's now tying intelligence to, I don't know, to survival. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, there's different kinds of intelligences that are more, I don't know, I'm just speculating now, but
well, and in both
what we see is that term gets, that definition of intelligence is, you can't use, I mean, this is now our Latourian instinct, right? We can't use intelligence to understand what's happening in Mechanical Turks, because Mechanical Turks is taking part in whatever intelligence is.
Right. Yeah, it's framing what that means.
Intelligence is at stake in Mechanical Turks. It's not a thing we can use to assess or understand Mechanical Turks.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, we're going way over here. So let's see, going forward, what I'm going to do first is shake out the rest of those keenness diagrams and measures. I need to do that just because right now it's a gap. I've only got the unigrams for the expanded. I need to do the rest of those. I'm going to turn to the word level stuff. I mean, in a sense, we're kind of back where we started. Because we do need to find word level stuff to examine. I think we can start by doing like the transcript summary split and see if these other words map to those. And if it makes sense to just treat these as a unit or to absorb these other ones by understanding their context a little better,
right,
into sort of two separate categories. Yeah, and then these things that are a separate thing, I think they're separate of, I don't know, like, you know, a lot of these deal with trauma. Yeah. Like, yeah, I think I called them trauma. Mm-hmm. Hurricane, cancer, veteran, and vet pops up, well-being, mental health, coping. No. Anywho. Ugh. All right. Well, yeah, we're gonna have to wrap it up just because of time.
Yeah. But no, I mean, I think this was, I mean, these are always productive.
Oh, yeah. The difficulty is finishing the paper, right?
Yeah.
Because these usually just give us more labor to do. What we'll need.
I mean, do we want to give ourselves that once we've got these expanded things, we just, I mean, I wonder if we just need to start writing it.
Yeah. I mean, that's because I always encourage writing from the middle. I think we can start writing up results. Yeah. Now, the one quirk is for me, I'm probably not going to have a ton of time until the end of the semester.
Yeah.
No, I've been seeing sort of a weird shadow discourse about, oh, I've got all this new time. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about?
I have no idea.
I'm doing my same job and now tech support for my department, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm broken under the, and, you know, let's see, that's the other thing that came up in our university discussion yesterday is they're like, nominate people who can take over your courses if you're incapacitated. And, you know, understandably, the first faculty question was, how are we supposed to do our own and someone else's courses at the same time?
Right. And do the things, I mean, you know, depending on the research, the institution that you're at.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, but who do I get to do my research, which is the thing upon which merit is largely based. And, you know, I mean, it's also this reminder that depending on the institution type you're at, is that depending on your institution type, teaching is actually literally only 30% of my job.
Right.
So figuring out what to do with that 30%, you know, what do I do with the other 70% that come annual review time you're going to ask me about?
They pausing your clock?
I mean, it's less of an issue for me because I'm post. There's no talk about pausing clocks for assistant professors.
Yeah.
And for associate, it doesn't really matter quite. We just have to wait a certain amount of time before we go up.
Well, although I just did, in fact, I guess it's still out there. My 5-year post tenure review. That was kind of, I finished it up as they're like, we're shutting down the school. And so I was like, well, is this still going forward? And they're like, yeah. So we'll see what kind of, this weirdness of, we can't tell yet if we're actually on the Titanic, and we've got very specific instructions about how to rearrange the deck chairs.
I mean,
no one really knows yet.
This is now the new joke it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Well, the guy rearranging the deck chairs probably didn't know the Titanic was sinking.
Right. Yeah.
Oh man, I might tweet
Anywho, that. So I think realistically, I think we can finish up. Yeah, those things. And we'll have to do some of the word level processing, I think, to write up results. Well, maybe I can write up some results. We'll see. Yeah. But probably this will be the end of the semester for me.
Yeah.
Which only is what, like 6 weeks? I don't know, 7 weeks.
That feels like forever. I don't.
Yeah. This is one of those infinity semesters.
No, and just, even just intellectually, even if I had the time, it's just the focusing, right? And this is why I think we're probably going so long and this is why it's useful to do this collaboratively. That, man, the idea of just being able to sit down and generate thoughts about things, it just seems like that I don't have time and the tank is empty.
Yeah. It also, at points, feels like you might as well just be throwing this into the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
Although I actually draw, a strong degree of comfort and normalcy from, well, now I don't have to think about it because I can focus on running keenness measures. There's a certain, the roteness of it, even though it's not rote, but I mean, it fills a particular void that takes you out, as has always been sort of the trotted out as an intellectual work. It pulls you out of your circumstances.
Yeah. Take solace in keenness.
All right. Well, so I'll let's see. What's the Friday? I can finish. Yeah. So I can wind up, I think, in the near future, those expanded keenness measures.
You said they'll take a little more time for the computer to run.
Yeah, but it's not crazy time. It's just like it could take a quarter of an hour or something. Okay. A lot of it's just fretting that it'll finish. There are some operations that you have to leave them running overnight. This is not that. It's just, it has to, and I got some tricks in my back pocket just in case.
Are you able to sleep when you're running data?
Yeah, I mean, there are some things, because it's just sort of like you'll wake up and you'll see, did it finish or did it throw an error, So I am. I'm not that hung up about it because
it's that time. I'm just checking in on you.
Yeah. Anywho, so I can probably wrap those up. Let's see. Let me do this also. Let me because this isn't on my, get over there. Here we are. So this is the list. We actually have here online, project data, this preliminary data findings.
Mm-hmm.
We actually started kind of briefly a document looking at this. Yeah, there they are. So I can probably,
here we go.
You know what I mean? So that way, at least we have, so it's not just on my desktop,
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I already did this.
Well, there's different, this list is different.
Yeah.
There's some things that you just added that aren't on there.
Yeah, well, I'll clean this up independently. All right, I mean, I guess that's where we go from here, assuming we're not careening into the void.
Yeah, I mean, keep rearranging the furniture.
Yeah. Get some nice patterns of furniture at the end of this. All right, I guess that's it. Anything else?
Yeah. No, that was it. But the expanded versus unexpanded, I think that'll help us give some. Something's taking shape, I feel like.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will presumably see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
All right.
Knock on wood.
Yep. All right. Take it easy.
All right. Bye.